Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video we're back with another Big Brother ranking I'm redoing after 5 years, and again another North American Big Brother ranking, where here I'll be doing my North American winner ranking, where obviously I've done my season ranking, mixing my BBUS and BBCAN lists together. I'll be doing the same thing here, but for the winners of the show. It's where, again, I'll be ranking every winner from these shows based on how good of a game they played on their respective seasons that they won, which, again, is just merging the two lists together with also the inclusion of celebrity. Now, again, I questioned if it was worth adding celebrity, and to be honest, I initially decided not to, but I realized I did last time, so I guess I'll do it again, even though the games are not really that comparable, as the formats are so vastly different, but oh well, I guess. But I still will not be including BB1, as it's BB1. OTT, as again, it's a show that there's not even a vote at the end. Public decides the winner, to where, while again there are a lot of social strategy aspects to lead up to that, it's still a game that is determined by a public vote, along with so many twists along the way that, again, I did not include OTT. And also, I will not be including reindeer games because Nicole Franzel's not a two-time winner of Big Brother. But with that, again, we do have 39 winners to rank here. Let's get started. At number 39, I do have a winner that is the only winner that really shouldn't be a winner. Obviously, there are people that talk about how which winners are deserving to win. Again, at the end of the day, deserve doesn't mean anything when it comes to Big Brother. If you win, you win. However, I do think this is probably one of the few situations where I would say, again, it is very fluky. At number 39, I do have Jillian from BBCAN 1. And this is simply because, again, Jillian shouldn't have won. She played a losing game. She played a game that fundamentally loses her the game almost every single time she plays. I mean, she was in a season where literally over half the jury agreed to vote against her, actively didn't want her to win, and the fact that she then proceeds to win simply because one of those people ended up voting incorrectly is, again, definitely a major knock against her game. So, again, we'll definitely get to some fluky winners as we're about to talk about, but even with those winners, they still played a winning game, all while Jillian played a losing game. And to fair, I think you can maybe excuse it a bit more, again, if the jury wasn't so hell-bent against Jillian. It was literally a jury that never would have voted for Jillian in any situation. They literally made an agreement to not vote for her, yet she ends up winning simply because, again, someone makes a mistake. Now, again, I think you give her credit for the fact that she did get 3 votes. Naturally, that is something. So while the rest of her game is, again, very, middle of the road, a somewhat competent second command game, really the jury management all was so abysmal that she really should not have won any season. Yes, she wins this one. So, again, she is technically a winner, so she's on the ranking, but I do think she is fundamentally the worst winner in the history of the show. She's here at number 39.
Now, number 38, we're moving from BBCAN to the worst BBUS winner, which is actually a change from the last ranking I did. For now that the dust is settled, I think I'm ready to say that the worst BBUS winner is Evil Dick.
And again, Evil Dick's game is bad. It's one of the worst winning games ever played. Again, he is a player that didn't play a natural game. Again, America's player was so fundamental to his win and literally saved them at multiple opportunities. I think he is definitely the winner that was benefited the most by twists to get to the end, to where, again, Dick's game is terrible. It is a really bad game. It is one where, again, he is someone that very much socially ostracizes people. He gets saved by twists numerously. Mind you, also, to fair, the twist does harm him at points as well, particularly early on in the game, where all the hinky votes lead to him getting suspicious of Eric, which causes his game to blow up. But still, I mean, at the end of the day, Dick's game is bad. It's very bad.
Now, again, I did not have Evil Dick at the bottom of my previous ranking, and the reason why that has changed now is, again, I do think I'm further removed from the other winner that we'll later talk about and my frustrations with him, but also I just feel like Dick's win is one that, again, just feels so embedded with the twist that was revolving around him, where while I do still, again, at least give him credit for more optimally navigating through the game at points than the next person we'll be talking about, especially based on their own perception of the game, I do still feel like so much of Dick's game revolves around America's player, and that ends up being really the end-all be-all of his game and the large reason why he is able to win the game. And at least with the other player, I do feel like they won due to more natural in-game means, even though they were also very benefited by other situations, but we'll talk about it. But either way, Dick is here at number 38. And now the 37, and again, this is the winner that was at the bottom of my BBUS ranking, has now climbed up a spot. That winner is Jagbane. insane. And again, Jag used to be at the bottom of the ranking. He is not anymore, though again, that doesn't really have to do much with what my overall opinion on what Jag's game is.
Where, obviously, again, I was very frustrated that Jag went at the time with him playing so suboptimally at points and actively taking someone to the end that he thought he would lose against, all while having been someone that was voted out and came back to the game, which I think is the biggest flaw that someone can have in their game. So again, Jag did frustrate me as a player when he did win. However, again, I want to reiterate the fact that Jag isn't so low simply because of the fact that he was voted out and came back to him. I do think that is, again, an issue. However, considering the fact that he literally comes back in the game immediately afterwards, it's not like this big fundamental issue that guarantees that he's on the bottom of the BBUS ranking or really the bottom of the winners that naturally won the game. Because, again, as we'll talk about for a lot of the winners that we're about to talk about, a lot of those winners also had very lucky circumstances. I think my issue with Jag is the fact that Jag was playing a losing game. At least in his mind, the fact that he actively takes Matt to the end in a spot where he thinks he's going to lose to Matt is the final straw for me. To where, again, I think the rest of his game is, again, still lackluster. I mean, he is essentially in a power position simply because he's winning comp after comp after comp. And again, he had an opportunity. He could have been taken out. They didn't take him out. Again, kudos to him for that. And through that, I guess you can, again, very much praise him for the work he does with Bowie Jane. But really, again, the rest of his game is a bit messy from my point of view.
Though, again, a major reason why he's not at the very bottom anymore is because, again, I do think he was at least able to navigate through the game through more natural means. Obviously, he gets saved by a twist at one specific point, but really beyond that, again, he is surviving due to comp wins, which, again, while still very luck dependent, especially in this spot where it just felt like all these competitions kind of catered towards his skill set and just were the same style of competitions over and over again, it still is a position where that is still at least a more baked in aspect of the game than America's player, which obviously feels even more luck dependent there, to where ultimately, again, I still think of Jag's game as one that is incredibly frustrating, especially with how much he was not really playing and what he even perceived to be his own best interest, and thinking he made a game-losing move at the end by taking Matt to the end when he had a very easy win against Bowie, while Dick, at least, again, I could say was playing more optimally throughout more of the season. But I do think the path there, again, now being further removed from it, is a spot where I can at least give Jag a bit more credit for how he navigates through the game in comparison to Dick's, where, again, I have him here at number 37.
Not 36. A winner that I've actually dropped on the winner ranking since the last ranking I did with him on, to where straight up, I just think this person's win is pretty bad. The more and more I think about it, the lower and lower I get on this person. At number 36, I have Ian. And again, I think Ian's game is terrible. Ian, obviously, again, SDN with Dan, beats Dan, wins a lot of comps, is mostly at the end simply because he wins all those comps. To where, again, I always analyze Ian as this person that, Ian wasn't necessarily saved by twist, but was saved by the fact that he won this big comp run. That is until I remembered the fact that, wait, he also was saved by a twist. Where at the final 8, if there was not a double veto, he more than likely does go home there. Where again, Brittany was only targeted because Ian was safe, because he had the second veto. To where if that was not the case, Ian does go home even in that spot. To where again, I think that is something that crossed my mind. I was like, wait, he should be lower then. To where again, I think Ian already played a bad game to begin with. I think he's someone that had no wherewithal on what was going on in the game. He very rarely made a move that was actually in his best interest, and again, just survived simply due to the fact that he won competitions, and him and Shane won enough to get to the final 4 where Dan had to save Ian in that spot. To where again, Ian's game sucks. I think his winning game's really bad, but I mean, again, he legitimately won a jury vote. He also took a person to the end that he thought he was going to beat, and also he didn't have the entire game rigged for him, so I guess he's at 36. Now number 35, moving on to a winner that also gets saved by a twist. But I think this one is a little bit less direct. We do have Rachel Riley, and Rachel Riley is a player that obviously I think there's a lot of criticism towards the final 6 round, and people talk about that. That's a spot where if it was not for Pandora's box, that Rachel probably doesn't win the game. I don't necessarily co-sign that. I think probably the bigger aspect of rigging through that is what the veto comp was, it being a competition that she had already won in week 1, where obviously she wins it again, wins the veto there, saves herself, wins HOH, stays due to Portia's vote, and then wins final HOH to get to the end. And straight up, if Pandora's box did not happen, I think that situation probably plays out almost the same anyway, where you just essentially swap out Jordan and Shelly, to where I think just based on how the comps play out, I think Rachel's probably still on a path to potentially win, to where, and that's not the biggest criticism for me. The bigger criticism for me is actually the Lawan boot round, where I feel like that's a round where, again, Rachel's probably gone if they don't announce beforehand that there's a twist coming in the following round. Because if it's not for that, then Lawan doesn't nominate himself, thinking that he's going to get a special power, and through that, Rachel's just probably done. I mean, who knows, and maybe Shelly still feels like it's worth fighting for Rachel and comes up with some other excuse and is able to actually convince Kalia to not target Rachel, but again, I do think it's a very precarious situation. I think in the spot that we do have, it is one where she is directly saved by that. So where, again, I think that is a big issue for Rachel's game, where I think there's, like, again, just a number of luck-based circumstances there, along with her essentially winning out as well. Again, it's not a good game. Again, she was in the majority alliance for the first, like, 2/3 of the game. Really, even the points where she's in danger, it's essentially because the minority ends up winning power, which puts her in danger to begin with. And again, she still maintained the loyalty of Portia by the end, so that's something. Again, it's enough to put her at 35. Now, number 34, moving on to probably the winner that got benefited by the most amount of twists, where this person came from a very twist-heavy season. And I think it's very tough to differentiate this player from the twist that happened on the season. I think that fundamentally changed how he navigated through the game, and that player is Sarah Hanlon from BBCAN 3. And again, Sarah's in a similar spot here of, again, I think there's multiple spots in the game where she's indirectly safe by twists. Again, it's not like there are positions where the twist directly ends up helping her in the sense that, again, like we had like Brittany's like coup d'etat power, which, again, that benefited Sarah significantly, keeping an ally in the game, also keeping a shield for her in the game, and it very much helped her. Yet it was something that was not, again, directly doled to her. Same thing goes with Cindy's return to the game. That is something that greatly benefited her. A spot where Cindy was literally told by the other pre-jurors to work with Sarah when she returns, where Cindy ends up being undyingly loyal to Sarah on the return, while also, again, adding another shield for Sarah there. Along with that, also, we got the triple eviction, where, again, Sarah doesn't win the HOH, but her closest ally in Brittany wins the HOH, putting themselves in a power position that she even then proceeds to mess up by voting out Willow. And even then, like, she proceeds to go on to win the game, kind of due to a misunderstanding to a degree. People thought she was doing a lot more in the game than what she actually was. And also even then, like, Godfrey just had a misread on the jury, which is why he cut Ashley over her to where, I don't know, it's like, again, a very rocky game. I think a very twist-heavy game, though, where, again, I just don't think you really properly assess her game without factoring in the fact that she was so benefited by multiple twists across the season. But she's still in the spot where I think her navigation through the game is still cleaner than the people we've talked about so far. Do you think she navigates through the game a bit more through social strategy means than the likes of a Rachel Riley, who I think gets to the end more so by the fact that she's win competitions at points where she would have been in danger? I think Sarah, again, at least has more points where her social game kind of helped her get through certain tricky positions to where, again, it's not much really, but it's enough to put Sarah here at number 34. Now number 33, we're moving on to our first celebrity Big Brother winner on the board. We got Marissa Jarrett Winokur from Celebrity Big Brother 1. And my placement on her game has stayed the same in the last 5 years. I think it's also a really bad game. I think there is arguments that she should be higher in the sense that in many ways she is a second command to Ross. However, even within that, Ross's game in itself is also very sloppy. Again, Ross is in and out of the majority at points. Ross would have gone home multiple times had it not been for the fact that he won specific competitions, where, again, Marissa being a second command to someone that has a very sloppy game is not necessarily that much praise for her game, but beyond that, she also in a spot where Ross was even loyal to her. Ross wanted to cut her at the end. Again, if Ross had one final HOH, she's gone. And again, to connect her to Jag, she does also take Ross to the end thinking that she would lose to him, so that's also very bad. Also, again, I think she's essentially saved by a twist, essentially more so a format change for Celebrity Big Brother, and the fact that the final four HOH gets to vote out the last two people. Again, if that was not in place and had Ross or Mark one final HOH, she's done. Also, if anyone else won Final Four HOH, she's also done. To where, again, I think she's in a spot there where I do look at that as essentially the same as her getting saved by twist, getting saved by a format change that no one expected. To where, again, I think it's all really bad. But again, the reason why she's this high on the list for me is, again, unlike Jag, she didn't get voted out and came back. I think that's something that, again, knocks him a little bit. I think in comparison to Dick, and game wasn't rigged for her, that's something. And again, in comparison to Ian, she at least knew what was going on for the entire game. She was actually working with someone that was involving her in the plans and not being completely deluded at what's actually happening in the game. So again, that's something. Again, at the end of the day, it's enough for Marissa to be here at number 33. Now, number 32, we're moving on to, again, might be criticized for being a tad too high, considering I feel like a lot of people say these are the worst winners of all time. Yeah, again, I do think there's at least a little bit positive within them to make them higher than that. At 32, I do have Nick and Phil, which might be a controversial placement. I do feel like most people would probably have Nick and Phil lower on the list. However, the reason why I have Nick and Phil this high is because, one, they were not directly saved by a twist. Nick and Phil, not really. Now, again, they had a massive comp run, which, again, I still dock a lot of points for. Also, again, if you want to say they were benefited by a twist, is the fact that Kelsey gets brought back into the game, who becomes their number 2 they win competitions with back to back. But I do feel like that is something that is very tough to gauge, as Kelsey was brought back to the game, again, a while ago at that point. And with, again, Kelsey being there, really just shaking up the numbers entirely to where I think it would just radically shift how they play the game with Kelsey not there, where, again, they probably just pair up with someone like Jared instead. And even then, the only round that could potentially shake up is the Final Five. And it's only the Final Five round that they don't win a competition. Even then, again, without Kelsey there, they could potentially still win the HOH. But really, at the end of the day, again, I think it's just something that's too tough to gauge to where I don't really knock that fully against them. But really, I think the thing to praise from them is that I actually feel like their games for like the first half of the game is actually like not that bad. Again, they are part of the mighty middle. They actually have a decent amount of connections within that. They are very tied to the likes of Tim and Cassandra initially. To be fair, they are part of the losing battle when Dallas goes home, but they're still not being directly targeted for a lot of the early portion of the game. So again, I'll at least praise them for, again, being somewhat well positioned early on. And even in their comp run at the end, again, they're winning alongside another person. It's not like they solely have to win competitions along the way, where it is them and Kelsey working together. It's not this completely antisocial navigation through the end game. But the fact that it is with Kelsey, who's someone that was voted out previously, makes it, again, a little rocky. And obviously, there was a lot of suboptimal play along the way. And obviously, them trying to nominate themselves at Final Six is just insane. But still, I think at the end of the day, Nick and Phil are sloppy players, but ones that, again, have little highs along the way, which put them high enough here to be here at number 32. Number 31, we're keeping with Big Brother Canada once again. At number 31, we do have Kevin Martin. And Kevin Martin is just a very weird winner on the board. It's a winner that I find it very hard to assess him because he does win out. He wins the game through winning competition after competition after competition. Again, he literally wins out from the final 8 on, which again is nearly unprecedented. However, it's a spot where he did a lot of the legwork to cause that to happen. Again, he openly talked about it in his preseason. That strategy was to get to the mid portion of the season to a point in the season where he had recognized the way that competitions were structured in the end game, and through that studied the way that the competitions worked, and would be able to nearly guarantee his placement to the end from that point forward, to where, again, it ends up being a type of winning out that I just don't know how to properly assess. I still think obviously you have to dock him for, again, being on the out socially, where, again, while he had a couple people here and there that would have potentially saved him at points, I do think he's still in a spot where most people were coming for him. He likely goes if he doesn't win a competition at almost every opportunity. However, by the way that he studied the competitions, he nearly guaranteed that he was going to win a lot of those competitions, especially any sort of quiz comp or competition involving days, where, again, he essentially broke the competition format of BBCAN. Now, beyond that, again, his early game is a bit rocky even still. Again, he is still being targeted by a lot of people. Mind you, again, there's outside the game influences there that definitely affect his game. But he is in a pretty solid spot early on, despite, again, having some niche people targeting him. But obviously, his game just kind of goes off the rails from week 5 on, where overall, again, it's a very tough game to assess. I still think, again, he has to be amongst, like, the lesser winners on the board here, especially considering how he didn't really even have that much influence at the point that he was starting to win out, to where, again, had he at least been able to get his way, been able to show a lot of agency in that portion of the game, I would probably put him higher. But for now, I feel like I still can't really justify putting him much higher here than number 31. Now, number 30, another player benefited by a twist, kind of, or at least we're set to. Also, winner, and I'm sure people are going to be upset this person being so low, but at 32, I do have Taylor Hale. And again, Taylor's a player that obviously faced off against a lot of adversity and overcame that. That in itself is impressive. However, again, that's not what we're ranking here. I'm not ranking the winners here based on how much they overcame in the game. I'm ranking the winners based on how much influence they had on the game and how well positioned they were throughout the game. And the simple fact is that Taylor Hale would have been the first boot on most given seasons. Where, again, obviously, I don't think she does much to cause that first boot, but the reality is, again, she was almost the first boot of the season. If there was a natural vote at that first eviction, she is gone. And yes, I know there was the backstage pass twist where she was going to be allowed a chance to save herself, and in that spot, then she more than likely does win the comp. So again, she would have been saved. Again, in that spot, she's saved by a twist that literally stopped her from being the first boo of the season. Where, I mean, again, I think for me, like, that is a big flaw there. And beyond that, her game is just, again, very rocky. Where obviously she ends up being involved in the leftovers and isn't technically in the majority group for a decent chunk of the game. But I think a big issue for me within that is that, one, she doesn't have much influence within the leftovers, but also, even when she does, she's not making the best decisions in the world. Again, like, when she's HOH, she's talking about putting up Joseph, and also just, like, completely fractures her own alliance that week. She also ends up being very much benefited by the Kyle situation, where had that not occurred, she is in a very rough position for the following week, to where, again, one, she's on the block even in that week, and to be fair, I think Monty probably goes home there, but again, following that week, she's in a very tough position. And beyond that, while I do think you can give her credit for getting Michael out, she also in the end game, loses the loyalty of Brittany. Again, Brittany tries to get her out of the game, literally votes for her at the final 5. Beyond that, also, Taylor kind of gets to the end due to a misunderstanding that pretty much the entire house's misread on the jury, that she didn't really do much to perpetuate. Where, again, there was a lot of talk in the house about how Turner's the biggest threat, to where, again, that's a lot of the reason why Monty cuts Turner at the end, thinking that Taylor's the easier person to beat, when obviously that's not the reality. But also, Taylor didn't believe that to be the case either. Taylor also believed Turner was the biggest jury threat. So again, it's also a wonky situation there, where, again, all around, I just don't think Taylor's game is really that good. While, again, it is impressive that she ends up winning after all the adversity that she faces. And again, her winning storyline is incredible. One of the best stories ever told on Big Brother. It's still a spot where her actual gameplay is just very sloppy, with her also being saved back in week 1, which is why I do have her here number 30. Number 29. To another winner, benefited by twists, but this one, not as much as you might think. We do have Jordan Lloyd. And Jordan is a player that constantly gets talked about as, oh, she only won because of coup d'etat. However, the reality is, I don't know if that's really the case. Now, again, I think at the end of the day, it's always going to be an unknown. We won't ever know what would have really happened without the coup d'etat. However, when people talk about it as if Jeff and Jordan were the next to go if the coup d'etat did not exist, when the reality is that's not the case. I mean, the likes of Kevin and Michelle were bigger targets than Jeff and Jordan, with Jesse and his alliance actually wanting to take Jeff and Jordan to the final 6, where, again, they had room to maneuver either way, considering how comps played out also. Again, Michelle wins next HOH, and again, just in general, it's I don't think Jeff and Jordan were as much of goners as people say that they were at the time of the coup d'etat being played. However, obviously, it does greatly benefit her game. It does put her in this majority alliance instantly at that point, with Russell staying in the game, I think probably being the best benefit of that. But, I mean, really, in general, her entire game is one that she's essentially just a lackey for Jeff, who in himself is also not a particularly impressive player here, to where, and obviously Jeff ends up going home, and then, again, you have Michelle, who's looked at as a bigger threat than her, and then she gets the final 3, where, again, I'll give her credit for convincing Kevin to take her to the end, and, again, in a spot where, again, Jordan might beat him, where, again, that is something. But, again, I don't really know how much Jordan did to cause that to happen. But, again, I think Jordan's game is, to me, not that actively bad, though it is one that, again, I still think you have to say she got benefited by the coup d'etat, but I would not say it's the thing that won her the game. But beyond that, again, her game's just a very passive, under radar game that has her just simply going to the win because everyone else is looked at as a bigger threat than her, in a spot where, again, she didn't really do much to lessen her threat level. She just actually is a lesser threat. So where, again, it's kind of a weird game. I don't think it's as bad as some people say, but also it's not that good either, to where it's here number 29. Now, 28, we're finally moving back to another celebrity Big Brother winner here. Again, the second one on the board, we got Tamar Braxton. And Tamar plays a game that, again, I also find very tough to really gauge. Now, Tamar's not necessarily someone that was, benefited by twists in the game. Outside of, I guess you can maybe debate the Final Four HOH format. And to be fair, I think you could also say she was very benefited by the fact that players got to see her from home and got influenced by social media, which I do think definitely played into Tamar's growing win equity, though, to be fair, I think she probably beats Ricky either way. But still, I think it's a spot where Tamar plays a very rocky game from beginning to end, where she's almost always attached to the majority alliance, but she's never really an integral figure within that. She simply is aligned with Lolo, Natalie, and Ricky, but always on the bottom of that group. And while, again, she has an outside the game relationship with Candy that she's able to navigate towards the end of the game, that definitely benefits her positioning at points. It's still a spot where, again, it's an out of the game relationship, which you wouldn't typically have in those given seasons. And really, just in general, again, I do feel like her game towards the end is just, again, very rocky. I think her jury management is typically terrible. Again, I think it just would not work on most given seasons. The fact that she is dancing on Tom Green's grave as he leaves is simply, again, not going to work with most people. But I think she gets definitely benefited by the celebrity format in that light, to where, again, these people just did not take this as seriously and just thought that Tamar was good TV. And beyond that, I think Tamar also gets kind of lucky in Ricky taking her to the end, where, and she essentially gets taken to the end by Ricky just because she said yes to a final 2 with Ricky in a spot where, somehow Lolo said no. Turget praise her for doing the obvious thing, but it's also a spot where I think this only ends up happening on something like Celebrity Big Brother, or, and I think this is kind of one of these spots where, it's very difficult to assess Tamar amongst BBUS winners and really just winners of seasons that had people taking the game more seriously, as I do feel like it's a spot where I think Tamar only wins the Celebrity season. I cannot imagine Tamar actually winning a actual real Big Brother season. Yeah, again, the game she played here was one that, again, she was at least attached to the majority. Yeah, never really that integral to that group outside of, again, them saving Candy over Joey. But again, it's a game that I do think she's playing pretty suboptimally for a lot of it. And again, just kind of stumbles into the win. But again, it's not one that is like very affected by twists or even a comp run in the way that we've talked about a lot of people up to this point. So because that, again, for me, Tamar's here at number 28. Now, number 27, we're moving on to a player that also was kind of this person like kind of dangling on to a majority alliance. So I do think they were a bit more solidified in the game. And again, also like won a proper Big Brother season. That person is Josh Martinez. And again, Josh's game is just very strange to assess. I mean, I do think he definitely got a factor in the fact that he probably is at least a target week one initially, had it not been for the fact that he won safety, to where, again, definitely benefited by a twist in that light. But really outside that, the rest of his game is him being attached to a majority group. And while, again, he's not really within the core of that until a bit later into the game, he is still, again, pretty safe as long as he's like not on the block against someone like Paul, to where, again, Paul was someone that was fighting for Josh to stay for a lot of the game, someone that had a lot of influence in the game. And even at points where, again, Josh goes on the block, he was never really in true danger. So again, obviously through that, there's a lot of bad social work along the way. He also just in general is a very sloppy player. He still does end up actually gaining Paul's loyalty. And while, again, that is because Paul thought that he was really beatable, which, again, turns out he was wrong, I still think it's a spot where, again, at least Josh does actually gain the loyalty of Paul, has Paul run the game in a spot where it benefits Josh by the end, and it really puts Josh in this position where he beats everybody at the final three. Where, again, Josh's like jury management ends up actually being pretty strong, even though he ends up treating people terribly at points before that. But Josh ends up being a player that, again, was in the majority for a lot of it, had a decent amount of win equity by the end. And while, again, he kind of stumbles into that win equity, he also, again, does do some good work to undercut Paul along the way. And in general, again, I think he ends up being like just kind of a fine, like non-dominant winner of the game. One that, again, still has that knock at the very beginning of the being saved in week one, which I do think is something to take into account here. But at the end of the day, I think it's a lesser knock than most of the people talk about so far. So again, for me, that's nothing but Josh here, number 27. Now, number 26, we're moving on to a player that I think over time has been talked about as like one of the most underrated players in the history of the show. And I think while there is a little bit of merit to that, I think over time it's gotten a bit too much. So I think at the end of the day, this person still did not play a particularly great Big Brother winning game here. And that person is Lisa Donahue. And again, Lisa is a player that was in this initial majority. I'll give her credit for that. Mind you, again, not particularly well insulated within that majority. Again, by week 2, her own majority flips against one of her closest allies and proceeds to actually flip on her, where they actually wanted to keep Eric around over her, even one of her closest allies in Kiara. So again, I think that's a major issue with her game. And she gets talked about as having played this like cutthroat game because she doesn't vote Eric back in. But the reality is that's pretty much the only thing cutthroat she really does across the season. Where outside that, she's really just kind of a lackey for Danielle, doing whatever Danielle wants, even at points not even being involved in what Danielle is doing. And even then, again, also, obviously, Danielle was not fully loyal to her, always more loyal to Jason. And I think that's a big issue. Now, again, I'll give her a lot of credit for surviving at the Final Four. I think that is a situation where she definitely should not have survived that. But the fact that she does ends up putting her in a spot where, again, obviously she wins the final comp and wins the game. Mind you, she's someone that, even like win equity-wise, it's not like she was like the biggest jury threat on the board, where, again, supposedly that was Jason, where, again, she obviously beats Danielle. She probably beats Amy. Maybe Marcellus. Still, I do think as a whole, Lisa's game is, again, just one of her, again, kind of just clinging on to the bottom for a lot of it. Her, again, having a good relationship with Danielle, and I think that's the main thing you give her credit for. But really, the rest of her game is just very rocky. Her never really being in a solid majority outside the very beginning of the game in a spot where, again, they instantly flip on her. And even in the back portion of the game, like she's being kept around, but not really fully looped into things that are happening, where she was like blindsided the Marcellus votes, where, again, overall, not a great game, but again, in comparison to the people we talked about, again, like didn't have this like very wonky circumstance in week 1 to save her like Josh, so it's enough to put her one spot higher, I guess, at 26. Now, number 25, moving on to, again, a similar winner here, but one that I think has a bit more influence in the game. And at 25, I do have Adam from BB9. And again, Adam is a player that also has a very rocky week 1 situation. I think that is the one argument you would give of why Lisa should be above him. The fact that, again, he almost is gone during that first power couple eviction, where had it not been for the fact that Jacob really blew up his game, Adam is probably gone there, where, again, he started off the game playing pretty terribly socially, and people did not like him initially, though he's able to recover that eventually. But again, I think Adam's game for me is better than the previous 2 that we talked about, because I do think Adam's game game does pick up towards the end, where while again there's still some sloppy play here and there, he is part of the majority for a lot of the end portion of the game, while also does a lot of good work in making Ryan do a lot of the dirty work for him, getting Ryan to do things that are not beneficial for Ryan's game, but more so beneficial for his. Where, again, I think that is something to definitely praise from Adam, even though I do think Adam's game outside that is, again, pretty rocky. I mean, I think he is in a pretty decent spot in the game for like a decent chunk of it, but is still in the spot where I don't necessarily agree with some decisions he's making along the way. And considering there is that week 1 situation as well, I do think it's very difficult to place him too high. Yeah, I do think it's still a spot where he at least did end up having a lot of influence towards the back portion of the game, which is enough for me to have him here at number 25. Now, number 24, moving on to the next U.S. winner on the list, we're moving on to Dr. Will. And obviously, a lot of people criticize Dr. Will being this low, but again, this is an assessment of his winning game, and I don't think his winning game is that good. So I know a lot of people go out and support Will's BB2 game, saying he was the first to do it, and that you can't compare BB2 to other seasons because of how different the format is. And the reality is, yeah, while again, I don't think he wins a modern season playing the game that he played on this season, being one that, again, I think he had his win equity definitely shoot up due to the fact that people saw him from home. Also, the fact that he's probably just voted out along the way with the veto in play, a veto that he probably never wins, considering, again, he was actually bad at competitions, not just throwing them. I do think Will's in a spot where, yeah, he does not win a modern game Big Brother, but he also almost doesn't even win his own game that he did win, where, again, it's still a spot, even without all these wonky circumstances, that he was still dangling on to the bottom for a lot of the game. He was so bad socially early on that people hated his guts and wanted to target him, to where he got very fortunate comp results that ended up leading to him being safe, like Krista winning in week 2, also against Shannon blowing up her own game in week 3 that keeps him safe. And again, I will give him credit for building the bond with Nicole and Hardy. I think that is definitely the strong suit of his game, but still a spot where he doesn't really have much influence on the game. Even in a spot where, again, he doesn't want to vote out Krista, he does simply because he doesn't really have power to do anything about it. And beyond that, also supposedly would have taken Monica to the end had he won final HOH, which is a spot where he loses to Monica. I think all in all, again, I just do not look at Will's game particularly fondly from BB2. So I think Will's BB2 game is probably the most overrated winning game in the history of the show, which is why I have him here at number 24. Number 23, and I cannot believe this person is this high. This is a winner that I remember coming out of this season thinking he's one of the worst of all time. However, again, when properly placing him on the board, I guess he is this high. At 23, I have Ty McDonald from BBCAN 11, and I cannot believe Ty is this high. As again, I think Ty's game is obviously a mess. It's one where he is in the majority early on. He's actually in the power position in the game. He's really dictating a lot of the early game. The problem is that he's doing it poorly, and he obviously takes out one of his closest allies in Roberto for no reason and proceeds to turn the entire house against him in week 3, almost quits the game, and proceeds to be on the bottom, kind of, from that point on. Where, again, the following week, he is on the block against Dan. Dan ends up going home over him, though I will say, again, there is some good work from him on that week, where he actually has the veto used on him, which is pretty impressive. But really, from that point on, again, he's in a spot where he essentially needs to comp out, and essentially does, where he does win a comp every round following that outside of the final 3. So again, I think that is very bad on paper. I think initially, again, my instinct obviously was to put him closer to the Kevin Martins, the Nick and Phils of the world. However, when thinking about it more, yes, again, he did need to win a lot of those comps, and that is very bad. However, also, I do think he does a lot of good work with those comp wins, to where, again, he's not someone like Kevin and Nick and Phil, to where even with their comp wins, they are very ineffective in the game. They very rarely got what they wanted. Ty actually is able to do a lot of good work with his comp wins. Again, through his comp wins, he's able to rebuild his relationship with Claudia, get Claudia to actually be loyal to him to the point where she cuts her own allies in favor of going to final 2 with him, which is pretty insane. Also, Ty is able to utilize his vetoes in a way to gain even more social capital in the game. And again, strong arm Claudia into getting rid of her own allies. So again, I do think Ty is able to use his comp wins to transition that into influence in the game. And I think that is something that is, again, at least impressive. And then when mixing that, the fact that, again, he also had, again, a lot of control early on in the game, I think it ends up being a better game than what I initially assessed, where I think it really is a very similar game to the next person that we'll be talking about, which is what raised him on the list here, where I really don't think there's that much of a difference between Ty and a certain US winner, where considering in the amount of influence he had in the game, I do think this placement does make sense. I think he has more influence on the game than really any of the people we've talked about so far. For a while, again, the way that he influenced the game is through winning a lot of competitions and in spots where he definitely would have been booted at multiple opportunities. I still think it's a spot where he's able to utilize those comp wins very effectively, where while the rest of his game is very sloppy, it's still enough to be here at number 23. Now 22, again, as I said, I think a game that is very similar to Ty's, I do think is better. I think there are less points where this person needs to win competitions, but still is in a spot where they definitely do need to win a lot of competitions. Though again, they did have a lot of influence along the way, and at 22, we do have Jackson Mickey. And again, Jackson and Ty's games, for me, in retrospect, are not that dissimilar. I think they are in spots where, again, they have a lot of influence early on. Mind you, I actually think Ty has more direct influence early on than Jackson, where Jackson's in the majority alliance, but I don't think he's really exerting his will in the game as much as Ty is early on in the game. Though, to be fair, Jackson maintains that majority for a bit longer, maintains that majority until week 5, in a spot where Ty only really does so until week 3. But still, I mean, like, at that point, Jackson's really on the bottom, and it is kind of a dead man walking. Now, again, I'll credit him for staying on the block over Jack, though at the same time, that's essentially just the Dan-Ty situation. And beyond that, again, Jackson essentially is in a spot where he needs to win out. Now, again, he's able to do a lot with his future comp wins, and the fact that he's able to maintain this relationship with Cliff and Nicole, make Cliff and Nicole pretty loyal to him, where while I do think they possibly would have taken the shot at him at like Final 5, they do, again, take him pretty deep into the game. Don't actually take the shot at him at Final 6 when they had the opportunity. So, again, I do think it's a spot where Jackson, while, again, in a spot where if he doesn't win a competition, he's very likely a target, he still is, again, able to influence a lot during that time. And, again, Final 5 rounds is a spot where, obviously, we see him do a lot of good work to keep Holly around. You can definitely qualm with how much that work was actually that necessary, but again, he does put in a lot of the legwork there, and again, really, it's like, I think his game is not that dissimilar from Ty's. Again, I think it is slightly better in the fact that, again, he maintains control early on, better than Ty. I think also a lot more of those spots in the middle portion of the game were not as do or die for him as they were for Ty, where Ty really didn't have really any allies for a few rounds in the middle portion of the game, while Jackson always had Holly, and even then, again, at points had Cliff and Nicole, where, again, I think Jackson is better than Ty, but I don't think it's by that much. And I do think it's a spot where both of them play very sloppy games, but both of them were able to course correct through the comp wins that they had and were able to gain a lot of influence through that. Where at the end of the day, I look at Jackson just a step above Ty here at number 22. Number 21, moving back to the BBCAN of it all for a winner that my opinion of this winner has gone down over time. I feel like I was pretty high on them at the time I did my last ranking. However, in the time since, I've definitely knocked this player down. I do feel like I look at them much more as a second command, if that sort of winner. And even within that, I think their navigation through the game is still pretty flawed. Again, not to the point of it being Jackson or Ty, but still very rocky. That player is John Party from BBCAN 2. And John is a player that, again, I think in many ways you can consider him the second command to Netta. Obviously one that eventually cuts Netta at the end, but still, I do think he was working alongside Netta. I do think Netta had a lot more agency within the group. I think Netta got her way within the group a lot more times, where again, I would give Netta the alpha position, while I think John is the beta. But in that even, I do think John's navigation through the game is, again, a lot sloppier, where while I actually think he was better positioned early on in the game, again, working with Kenny and Andrew, he also ends up losing their trust along the way, to where coming into week 5, before Canada's HOH, he was actually the main target for that side, and he could have potentially gone home had one of the opposite side won the competition, though obviously, again, Canada's HOH came in and saved him. I knew, again, he still had a good amount of allies at that point. Again, it was essentially a 50-50 chance of him being targeted or not, but obviously Canada's HOH is something that did benefit him. And beyond that, again, I think his game is, again, good, but still one where, again, Netta gets her way. At the Arlie eviction, where that wasn't necessarily the right call for John in particular. I do think also at the Adele eviction, that's a spot where Netta gets her way, and a spot where that significantly harms John's position as well. Where, again, credit to him in the fact that he wins those final few competitions that he needs, and does make the correct call in cutting Netta at the end in a spot where he would have lost the Netta. Though, again, I would give him credit for those moves in particular, but I do think it's still a spot where his entire navigation through the game is very rocky. You can also debate the fact that he was saved by a twist, where, and at the end of the day, I do think it's still a solid game, but one that has a lot of holes alongside it, to where, for me, it's only enough to be up here at number 21. Now, number 20, we're moving on to probably one of the toughest winners to ever assess, considering there are so many just weird circumstances revolving around this person's win, and that person is Xavier from BB23. And Xavier is a winner here that, again, wins the game, but in a way that feels like he is very fortunate to get to that position, where I've said this many times before, I do think Xavier's game is one where I don't think he wins if it was not for the cookout. I do not think if he played in that one specific time where all the black players in the house had this further incentive to work together in a way that they were blindly loyal to their alliance, I don't think Xavier wins the game. I do think he's in a spot where if the game had naturally played out on that season, he's out probably mid-jury, probably around Final 8, Final 9. He's in a spot where, again, him and Tiffany definitely were feuding. He's definitely in a spot where Tiffany would have had a lot more influence. It was never was definitely losing faith in Xavier towards the end game stretch. To where again, I think Xavier's probably just, and with all of Tiffany's allies, also why Xavier gone through a lot of that end game stretch. Again, I think Xavier's pretty screwed on any other season. But again, it works out for him on this season. And I will say, considering that fact, he does play within the cookout well. Now, again, I think he completely fails at maintaining these relationships outside the cookout, but within the cookout itself, I do think he does good work in maintaining Big D's loyalty, also is able to maintain Oz's loyalty, and he's able to maintain Kylan's, though that one's just Kylan being Kylan, but still, I do think, again, within the cookout, he does a lot of good work, which is the reason why he's not completely towards the bottom of this list. Again, the reason why he is as high as he is because he, again, did have a lot of influence within the actual cookout itself, but again, I do think the fact that the cookout was the dominant alliance of the season is something that literally only happens on this season. And again, if the game had played out through more natural means, I think it's very abundantly clear that Xavier would not have been able to do what he did. Or he feels like a winner that was very benefited by the time that he played. And because that, again, it makes his game very tough to assess. But again, I do think without looking at those things, he does play, again, a seemingly dominant game, a game where he is on the top of the cookout power structure for a lot of the game, while also, again, being relatively safe for the first half of the game. And there's definitely strong suits there, but I still think his game is, again, a bit sloppy for my taste, where he's here number 20. Now, number 19, we're moving on. The last of our celebrity Big Brother winners, a winner that I really did not know what to do with this person, but at number 19, we do have Misha Tate. And Misha's someone that I very much struggled on where exactly to land her. I very much debated on, is she a second command winner? Is she a co-dominant winner? And I did end up siding with more second command, largely because I do feel like it was Todrick's game. I do feel like it was Todrick that was really running the show, really Todrick that did a lot of the legwork to have these connections with all the other people to allow them to navigate through the game pretty smoothly. Beyond that, also was able to get his way and having better options for him at the end. Again, having someone like Cynthia at the final three that would have taken Todrick. I think those are all points to be made to have Misha as a second man winner, but she's still someone that obviously was very dominant in competitions. Probably one of the most dominant like single performances in the history of the show in terms of competitions, but also to fair, it's Celebrity Big Brother, and look at the cast she was facing off against when she's a professional athlete. But still, it's still a spot where Misha ends up having a pretty strong performance, is able to be in power for the majority of the season. The one point that she's not, again, Todrick does a lot of good work in throwing Shayna under the bus. And again, she plays a mostly stable game. I would say the one thing that really ends up sinking her here, especially compared to the next person we'll be talking about, is the fact that Misha barely wins the game. I think she only wins against Todrick, where really the jury was very anti-Todrick and Misha, and literally only votes for Misha in the spot where she's against Todrick, to where, while that was always going to be the situation that she personally was striving for, it's not like she did so with the intention of beating Todrick. I don't think she knew that she would beat Todrick. And even then, the fact that she only beats Todrick is also pretty bad. To where, again, I think her jury prospects are pretty wonky, though, again, her navigation through the game is mostly solid, but I do question how solid it was because of the work that she actively did. But I think it's, again, good enough to be a second command winner here at number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a winner that, again, keeps their list from the last time I did the ranking. Again, a pretty definitive second command winning game, and that game comes from Casey Clark from BB20. And again, Casey's game is, again, just her being the second command to Tyler. Tyler runs the show. She's alongside that, also pretty well positioned, very rarely in danger, but still not as well positioned as Tyler. But also produced, again, win a lot of endgame comps that really solidifies their position even more, though has, again, wonky winner prospects, and she barely beats Tyler. I do think if the jury format had been a little bit different, I think Tyler probably does beat her. But again, in the format that we got, again, she beats Tyler. She probably loses the JC, though to be fair, there's no real way of her getting to the JC. But still, I do feel like she really just plays this, again, loyal game, good at competitions, very rarely in danger, even though, again, she was definitely in a bit of a rockier position towards the end game, where had comps gone certain ways that she could have potentially gone home, especially if JC had won some of those end game comps. But still, again, I think just a very solid second command winner. Pretty much the definitive second command winner for Big Brother here. Again, someone that remains loyal to their alliance the entire time, never turns against it, but also, like, theoretically never needed to, considering she actually beats the person that she was more loyal to where, while, again, Tyler has a lot more agency throughout the game, again, she does end up beating Tyler. Or while, again, I don't know how intentional that necessarily is, it is still the reality of her position, to where, for me, again, solid middle tier game here at number 18. Now number 17. And now I think we're getting into some of the better winners from my point of view. Again, winners that I think won a lot more due to their own accord than players around them were necessarily doing. However, still a winner here that, again, very mixed bag of a game. At 17, we do have winner from Big Brother Canada. We got Tyshawn from BBCAN 9. And again, Ty here is, again, a winner that very in and out of the majority. Like, I think in many ways you can kind of look at him as having a similar game to John Party. I think a difference for me, though, is I think Ty was a lot more independent in the way that he thought through the game. Again, it's not like John, where John had Netta that kind of led him in the game. Ty was a lot more independent. Again, Ty, while again, I think his early game's very rocky, and I think he gets very benefited by certain comp results where he had like half the house targeting him. I think that is bad, but he's still in the spot where, again, he is able to maintain loyalty from like Kiefer and Victoria. Once we get to the end game stretch, he really takes the game by the reins. Again, by the final 6, he blindsides Jed, which again, I question if that was the right call over someone like Beth, but still, it's like he makes this cutthroat move and taking out his number 1 ally and then proceeds to still kind of run the show from that point forward, where really the main criticism at that point is his win equity, where I do think a criticism just in general for Ty for me is I do think he struggles with the jury vote against most people, and supposedly he outright loses to both Tara and Kiefer. Even in the position where he's against Brayden, he only wins because he had one final HOH where the jury had agreed to just vote for the person who won final HOH, which is ridiculous considering how much better Ty's game should have been perceived than Brayden's. Though again, the fact that, again, he really dominates the endgame stretch and the jury just did not care, did not really want to reward him the win, I think is definitely questionable there. But I do think, again, Ty's game is still very solid. I think he, again, is able to make more moves independently than any of the people we've talked about so far. But I still do question, again, were those moves necessarily the right ones, along with the fact that, again, his positioning for first half of the game is very rocky. Where while, again, he's in a very good position over the first couple weeks, he then loses control and is, again, benefited by who specifically is winning those competitions, where, again, it's kind of a weird game. I still think there's enough good there to where, again, I would quantify him as, again, a good winning game, but one that, again, definitely has a lot of issues along the way that keeps him at the bottom of these better winners here, putting him at number 17. Now number 16, moving on to a bit of a strange winner in a sense that this person is someone that was kind of at the bottom of their alliances, but kind of actively so, but does, again, pull off the move that was necessary to win, and that person is Steve Moses. And again, Steve's game is one that, again, is strange in the sense that he does detail his entire strategy before the season and really executes it to a T. He is able to play the bottom of his alliance and make an alliance with the person at the top of it and ends up riding that person to the end only to cut them at the end. And again, he does literally that. Again, it is impressive. He's able to detail the strategy from the very beginning and actually execute that. But it's also a strategy, again, that doesn't have much control in the game, and that's what makes it tough when assessing this. Like, in terms of like the intentionality of Steve's game, again, he's probably one of the most intentional winners of all time. But in terms of like how much control he necessarily had within that intentionality, a little bit of that is very questionable, where I think he gets pretty fortunate in the fact that Vanessa is this person that runs the game and does actually take him to final 3, but again, he does obviously have the awareness to cut her at final 3. But again, he is involved in the majority the entire time. He is, again, at the bottom of the Sixth Sense, but he is still, again, in that alliance. And even get like Johnny Mac towards the end, who he had a good relationship with, even though, again, Johnny Mac got voted out and came back. But still, I think, again, there's some good stuff there from Steve. I think he is, again, a very solid winner of the show, but I do think the fact that he doesn't have as much control in the game as a lot of people we're about to be talking about, where I think there's very few points where Steve has a lot of agency in making things actually happen, but he is well positioned for a lot of the game and is very intentional in his game, which again is enough to put him here at number 16. Now number 15, we're moving on to a winner that is kind of the opposite in the fact that they very much lacked a lot of strategic intentionality in their game, but they were also very good socially and also very good at competitions, which kind of helped them out. And that person is Drew Daniel. And again, Drew's game is one where I think I would reward his win almost entirely due to social game. I do feel like he is someone that was just very well liked. And to be fair, again, he was the, again, typical all-American guy that definitely has an easier time playing a game of Big Brother. But I do think, considering those factors, he plays it pretty well, and people liked him throughout the entire season. He was never really in danger for really the entire season. To be fair, a lot of that came down to his relationship with Diane, where Diane protects him through the game, but again, still have to give him credit for building that relationship with Diane. And again, like Steve, I think you could say that obviously he was, again, the secondary to a duo that he cuts at the end. Now, I think Drew's better and worse in certain regards to that. I think better in the sense that I think he also beats Diane at the end anyway. He didn't even need to cut Diane. But again, worse in the sense that I don't know how intentional any of that is for Drew. Where again, I think just in general, his strategic game is something that I don't fully know how much to give him credit for, where it does seem like he ends up being in these very strong positions in the game, but not very intentionally so. Where it seems like it was more so because Diane did those things to put him in that good position, but again, he did a lot of good work to make Diane do those things. So again, it's a bit of a rocky game in that sense, along with him, again, also like losing his Four Horsemen alliance along the way, but even then being able to rebound with the twins, and the twins go along the way as well. But again, like it is a spot where I think Drew's game, again, is solid, though I think it is probably one of the least intentional winning games in the history of the show, but still, again, a game that, again, had him well liked by the majority of his cast. I think he's also in a spot where he probably beats the majority of his cast as well, where I think the only person that gives him trouble in the end game is Karen. So again, I think Drew plays a very solid winning game, and very much in line with Steve's, though kind of from polar opposite sides of the game. But considering in Drew's seemingly higher win equity, it's enough to put him here at number 15. Now number 14. At 14, we're going to one of the strangest winners on the board. A winner that I've actually not been able to talk through on a winner ranking. And that person is the most recent winner, Big Brother Canada. Here we do have Bailey from BBCAN 12. And Bailey is this weird player in a sense that I think part of her game is really bad. I think her early game is very sloppy. She's on the bottom for a lot of it. While she does have allies, those allies were not necessarily fully loyal to her. It was definitely a spot where she had a lot of people wanting to target her, to where, again, that is bad. However, she's really able to turn that game around. Again, by the end of the pre-jury phase, she's able to actually gain a lot of influence in the game. She really is in Victoria's ear, getting Victoria to do things that are not in her best interest. Mind you, again, I think it's not necessarily intentional from Bailey in doing so, where Bailey is not fully aware of how the game is actually being played, not fully aware that she's not actually in this big core alliance, but the fact that she's deluded into thinking so allows her to really campaign effectively to Victoria. Victoria does these things under the logic that she's in this alliance that she's not actually fully loyal to, which is, again, a very strange circumstance, but it is actually kind of impressive for Bailey, for her to be able to get Victoria to do these things that are not in her best interest, but also at the same time, it's Victoria. But I think the other impressive thing is that even within that, she's able to also do the same thing with Anthony. She's able to also get into Anthony's ear. And while Anthony, again, is a much more independent player, she's still at least able to get Anthony to like her and want to keep her safe, and again, take her to the end of the game, which is very impressive. And along the way, Bailey's able to maintain a lot of win equity, still have very good relationships with people that leave the game, while also being able to keep Todd in the game. Again, this very loyal number, solely loyal to Bailey, and keep him all the way to the final four, which I think is very impressive. Again, Bailey is this like weird enigma of a winner that starts off very rocky, and while never being fully aware of the game that she's actually playing, is able to still maintain a lot of influence in the game, specifically because she ties herself to these two returning players that have a lot of influence in the game. And again, it is a weird game to rank here. I think there could be arguments that should be lower. I personally do think, though, if we're ranking this on like how much influence they had in the game and how well positioned they were in the game at points in the game, I do think she is better than the likes of Steve and the likes of Drew. Where I actually do think she has a lot more influence in the game than either of those two. Where, well, again, I think Steve was definitely a lot more intentional. Now he played, I think Bailey, again, had more agency in the game. Well, also, wins against pretty much anybody at the end, outside of, again, maybe Victoria, but again, had a lot of win equity. And again, was able to convince Anthony that she didn't. Tori takes her to the end, where, again, I do think Bailey's game is, again, pretty impressive, all things considered. This is why I have her number 14. Number 13, moving on to another BBCAN winner, the one that is kind of in a different tier in my mind than Bailey. I think this is kind of starting this more like floater-esque tier of winners. Though, again, even that's like a little bit of a rocky description of this person's game. But at 13, keeping BBCAN, we have Paris from BBCAN 6. And Paris, I think, is one of the tougher winners to assess. I think she's a winner that also, again, was definitely unaware of the game at points while she was involved in a lot of the alliances at points. Again, we did see through her cam talks that, again, she didn't necessarily know what was fully going on at all times, but still, again, I think plays a very solid game. Again, she's very rarely in danger for the majority of the game, and she's also, again, involved in a lot of the groups that are forming early on in the game, has a core four early on with Jesse, Derek, and Kayla, still maintains that relationship with Derek and Kayla throughout a lot of the game, also ends up being the leader of a trio that ends up sticking that ends up having a lot of influence throughout a lot of the game, and her, Maddie, and Will, where somehow they're not targeted through a lot of the game. The fact that they just get deeper and deeper into the game, and Paris is, again, the leader of that group, definitely puts Paris in a very strong position in the game. So it essentially puts them in a swing position multiple times in the game. And while, again, I think you can qualm with the decisions that she ended up making at points, I definitely think she makes some moves that are not necessarily, I would think, is in her best interest. It still puts her in a spot where she does get to the final 5, like, pretty much unscathed, never in danger, having, again, a decent amount of influence at points to where, again, I think her game up to that point is very solid. Now, again, I think her game does kind of crumble a bit towards the end game, to where, again, while comps play out in her favor, her winning the final 4, final 3 HOHs, she's still in a pretty precarious spot at that point. Mind you, again, I do think she actually does win the loyalty of Kayla, to where I do think Kayla keeps her at the final 3 anyway, but still, I do think it's, again, a rockier end game than someone that, again, we would have higher on the list. I do think those last few rounds are not particularly great, along with, again, definitely some wonky decision-making at points, but I still think Paris's game is, again, very solid. I think she's, again, like, essentially the leader of her voting block, to where's a voting block that ends up being pretty integral to the game, where, again, I think considering that fact, and I do think she's in a spot where she does have a lot of influence in the game, while also being really safe throughout a lot of the game, while also, again, beating a lot of people at the end as well. I think she probably beats everybody by the time of the final 5, to where, considering all those things, I feel like her game is strong enough to be here at number 13. At number 12, moving on to, again, another floater game, one that, again, I think has a lot of pros and cons in comparison to Paris, but at number 12, we have what is dubbed as the original floater. We have June. And again, June's game is one that I think is very impressive in the sense that she, again, is also very rarely in danger. Really, up until like the final 4, I don't think there's really a way to get June out of the game. Also, she ends up being like very aware of what's going on in the game, very aware of her position in the game. And while, again, she definitely loses some battles along the way, again, losing Dana relatively early on, she's still in a spot where, again, she's floating in the middle for a lot of the game, not really being targeted, still maintaining relationships on both sides. Again, like a pretty quintessential game. While also, again, picking up Allison towards the end, working alongside Allison, get to the final 2. Mind you, again, I think that's where we get some qualms. Again, I think first in the fact that I do think Allison was a lot more the one that perpetuated that alliance than June. Again, I would give Allison more credit for like the creation of that duo, along the fact that I also feel like June seemingly only beats Allison, where I think June very much struggles in a jury vote against pretty much everybody else. To where, again, in comparison to someone like Paris definitely has a lot more win equity than June. And I think for me, it is really the win equity angle of it that does sour my opinion of June's game, where otherwise, again, it's a very solid game. Again, she's not really dominating the game. She's not really having a lot of direct control in what's happening in the game, but she is still maintaining a very safe position in the game, which I do think for Big Brother in particular is probably a lot more important than having outright control at every little point. To where, again, I think June's game is very impressive. I do think it's one where, had she just had a bit more win equity, I'd definitely argue she should be a decent chunk higher, but considering that lack of win equity, and also, again, some things like just falling into her lap, I feel like it's enough to put her here at number 12. Number 11, I mean, similar thing. I think this winner is actually like in a similar position. I think, again, they probably had a little bit more win equity and probably has like better individual like moves, but at the end of the day, their game is not that different. At number 11, we do have Nicole Franzel, obviously her game in BB18. And again, Nicole also plays a very floater-style game. I think a bit different than June's, the fact that I feel like June was working very independently for a lot of the game, where while she obviously had these connections here and there, she was really floating through the game independently, while I feel like Nicole was kind of floating in the game with other people at points, while also, again, probably had a lot more individual points where she does a lot more like active work in the game. And Nicole is, again, someone that is in a very strong position for an early portion of the game, kind of out in front at the very beginning, though ends up falling into the background, where Polly really takes the reins of the game, but again, still relatively safe up until the Polly eviction, where again, she ends up being on the bottom for a little bit, but then recovers pretty well. Again, I think she does very good work in rebuilding her relationship with James and getting Natalie and Michelle to turn against Paul and Victor, which, again, I think is a very impressive move there. And really from that point on, I think she navigates through the game very well. I mean, at the final 7, her picking up Paul and taking out Michelle ends up being a very strong move for her there. Following round, again, her allowing Victor to win HOH so that he takes the shot for her against Natalie, I think is very good, along with her and Corey to then win the comps the following round to take out Victor. I think is all, again, very strong play there, very good navigation through the game. I think a big qualm, though, for me, for Nicole, is the fact that I do think her intention was to take Corey to the end in a spot where I do think Corey beats her. I think that is definitely a big worry there. I think that for me, is one of the big criticisms of her game that makes me question if she should be better than June. Where I think in terms of navigation through the game, I think Nicole was more out in front for a little bit more in the game. I think she, again, does have probably more like individual moves on her resume, but at the same time, I do think June's game was a lot more intentional than someone like Nicole's, who kind of stumbles into her winning situation. But again, I think it's a bit close between the two. I do think the deciding factor for me is win equity, to where, again, I do think Nicole beats more people than June, where June, I think, only beats Allison. I think Nicole, again, does beat anyone in the Final Four outside of Corey, to where, again, that's something at least. To where, again, I do think it's close between her and June. Yeah, I do give the slight edge to Nicole here, so she's here at number 11. Now number 10, and at number 10, we're moving on to, again, a winner that I think is like a step above Nicole. Realistically, like, not that dissimilar of a game, even though I do think his duo is a lot more out in front. But either way, at number 10, I do have Boogie. And again, Boogie obviously is in a season where he's alongside Will. Him and Will really run the show for a lot of the season. They have a lot of influence in what is happening in the game. And while, again, I do think Will is someone that I would credit a lot more for their overall success, I do think Boogie is someone that gets a bit underrated in what he was able to do for the duo, and having specific relationships that allowed them to have control in the game in certain avenues. Where, again, I do think Boogie, again, plays a co-dominant game from my point of view. I think a criticism here is the fact that he wanted to go to the end of Will in a spot where Will wins over him. Though at the end of the day, again, that's not that dissimilar of a criticism of Nicole's. And similarly to Nicole, I do think Boogie beats both Erica and Janelle, and realistically probably beats a lot of the people on this season outside of, again, Will and Danielle, to where, again, I think that's probably a little bit of an edge for him in comparison to Nicole. I do think he probably had more win equity than Nicole in the grand scheme of things, but beyond that, also, again, I think him and Will were, again, more out in front in my point of view. I do think they were more openly controlling the game for more of the game, to where while I do think they make a bigger blunder at the Final Four than Nicole does, where I don't feel like Nicole really makes a mistake to cause Paul to target her and Corey at 4, where I feel like Will and Boogie definitely do to cause Janelle to target them at 4. And I think that is definitely a bigger criticism against Boogie, but really as a whole, again, I don't look at their games as that dissimilar. I think both Nicole and Boogie are players that were, again, out in front at points, co-dominated certain aspects of the game, and also had, again, kind of flawed end games, where, again, I think they're both very strong. I would say, again, considering I do think Boogie's game is a little bit more out in front, I do have Boogie ahead of Nicole, though it's not by that much, but again, Boogie is here at number 10. Now, number 9, moving on to another, like, kind of semi-dominant game from my point of view, one that, again, I think this person had a very dominant end game stretch, but their early game, a bit rocky. And that player is, again, probably the best player of all time. We got Dan Giesling. And again, this is an assessment of Dan's game, not his ability as a player as a whole, where, again, if we're simply talking about BB10 game, it's very good. Again, I think really from the Jesse eviction on, Dan is in a very strong position from that point forward. Again, having a Final 2 with Memphis, having a Final 4 with Rennie and Keisha, also having a good relationship with Keisha, also having most of the house like him. So again, I think he is in a very good spot. I do think there are criticisms to be had, and the fact that obviously, again, he was on the bottom early on. Mind you, again, I think Brian did a lot more of the sloppy play at that point in the game, but still, Dan is attached to him, and while, again, he plays the bottom pretty well following that, it still is a criticism that he kind of falls from grace at the very beginning of the game. Also, I'll criticize his Final 5. I do think just in general, his relationship with Jerry is one that he's not really able to fully recover in a spot where Jerry wanted to target him at 5, and Dan probably goes home. Had nominations stayed the same, where, again, I think that's another criticism there, particularly one that affects him amongst, like, the best of the best winners that we're about to be talking about. But again, Dan is a player that, again, faces off against a lot of adversity, overcomes that, and proceeds to actually play a pretty influential game in the back portion of the game, with also some masterful jury management. I think he beats almost everybody on this season, which is, again, a very impressive stat for him, to where, again, I think because of all those things, again, Dan's game, well, again, definitely sloppy in the sense that he loses control at points of the game. I think he's playing pretty optimally for the majority of it, and is able to have a lot of control throughout major portions of the game, which is what puts him here at number 9. Now, number 8, and now we're at the top 8, which to me, these are the dominant games of Big Brother. These are games that these players had a lot of influence throughout really the entire season. Again, maybe there's like individual points where they lose control, but again, still very impressive winning games with them being pretty out in front for the majority of them. Though with that, we're going to be starting it off at number 8 here with, for me, the lesser of all these. I think a winner that kind of gets a bit more lucky in terms of how they get to the end. And that winner is Maggie from BB6. And I do believe Maggie is lower here than what she was on my winner ranking. I think I dropped her down below at least one other US winner since the last list. But again, Maggie is a winner that plays a dominant game in the sense that she is at the top of her power structure. She is at the top of the Friendship Alliance. Again, an alliance that was half the house. Again, I think that is an impressive position to be in, while also, again, not really being targeted by the other side. The other side never really goes for a direct shot at Maggie at any point in the season. Now, with that, I think are a lot of criticisms. First, in the fact that, again, the other side hated her guts and did not want her to win, to where I think she largely wins simply because she was against Yvette, who was someone that had even worse jury management than her, with Rachel in particular, which causes her to lose the game. To where, again, I think Maggie's win equity is terrible and really has, again, easily the worst win equity of anyone, the winners that we have left on the board at this point, but also, again, probably worse than a lot of the winners that we've talked about even more recently. Or again, I think really outside of June, I think her win equity is worse than a lot of the winners we just talked about. To where, again, I think Maggie's win equity is definitely very rocky. Well, also her navigation through the game is one where even that in itself is very rocky. To where I do think she has benefited by the secret pairs twist, which kind of allowed for there to be these like other targets ahead of her. Also, I think it allowed for Eric to really set up this power structure for her, to where it really is just Maggie taking over the power structure that Eric had already put together. While beyond that, I do think Maggie is essentially also in the spot where, again, she pulls off the move of the season. Again, convincing Howie to put up James is essentially a game-winning move from her all the way from the final 10, or at least a game-winning move for her side, I think is probably the better way to phrase it. But again, it is a very impressive move that allows the Friendship to have the numbers coming into the jury, which essentially auto wins a Friendship member the game if they get to the end, where, again, that's also an impressive aspect of Maggie's game. I just think, again, for me, I do think she very much lucks out how things play out. Again, a spot where, again, I think literally the only person in her own alliance that she beats is Yvette, which, again, she beats Yvette due to nothing that Maggie actively did, more so just because Yvette messes up on her own. And again, she really only had control of like half the house. The other half of the house hated her guts. So, again, it's a bit of a tough game to assess, but I do think she was at the top of the pecking order of half the house that did have a lot more leverage in the back portion of the game, and a lot more leverage because of the good things that she was doing in the game. So again, I think that is enough to put Maggie here at number 8. Now, number 7. And number 7 here is a bit of a weird game in the sense that, again, I'm attaching him to the dominant winners. The other thing is questionable if dominant is necessarily the right term for his game, but it is a very impressive game, and a game that I thought about putting higher. I just think this person was in a lot more danger in a lot more portions of the game, to where it's tough to really have him higher on the list, but it's a very impressive game, and that game comes from Kevin Jacobs from BBCAN 10. And again, Kevin Jacobs' game is very impressive. Again, it is a game where he starts off from the very bottom. He is, again, a nominee in week 1 and proceeds to never really be involved in any like true alliances for early portion of the game. No major alliances, at least, where in many ways, again, I think you compare him to someone like Dan. And he was kind of a bottom dweller at the very beginning of the game, but was doing a lot of good social work along the way to build these relationships up to a point where, again, when we get to the Tanisha vote, I do feel like Kevin really takes the reins of the game. Again, ends up building his power structure around him, formulating these two sides while also making himself not a big target from the other side of the house, but ends up solidifying his side and taking out Tanisha, and proceeds to still face adversity beyond that, but kind of overcome it at every single turn. Again, he's able to really get his way at multiple points. Again, he ends up being essentially the Marty whisperer and able to get Marty to take out Herman after he swore that he wouldn't do so. I mean, to be fair, I think Kevin made his scheminess a bit too open to where Marty starts to distrust him, but still it gets to a point where he's able to win Marty back and avoid being nominated when the gummy bear situation happens. He also does really good work in maintaining this relationship with Helena, but also especially Josh. And again, I think him getting Josh to take out his own allies over him is pretty insane. Again, that triple eviction of him putting up Betty and taking out Summer is, again, very good play from Kevin. But again, I do think his endgame's a little bit rockier again. To be fair, comps are not playing out in his favor, which is a major reason for that. But again, he's able to stay off the block in the final 5 and really have sole control over that vote, even though, again, he very much wavers in that, and I think that's a little bit questionable, and it ends up working out for him. But again, he's able to stay in the final 4 over Helena and proceeds to convince Josh to take him the final 2, which I do think is very impressive work. To where, really, in general, I think Kevin Jacobs' game is, again, one of the most impressive games ever played. Though I do think the criticism here for his game is the fact that, again, it's one where he was never in that good of a spot throughout the entirety of it. Again, he has a lot of influence in the game. He's able to get his way throughout a lot of the game, but he is always facing adversity. And again, in comparison to the winners that we're going to be talking about following this, they were in more solidified alliances. They were more secure in the game. than someone like Kevin Jacobs, which is why I do think makes his game very tough to assess. But I still think it's a very impressive game, one of the most impressive performances in any given season, with just so many times where he should have been down and out, but is able to get out of that. And again, with him being able to maintain this influence in the game, I do think, again, it's still enough to consider him in this dominant tier, putting him here at number 7. Now number 6, and now we're on to the truly dominant winners that were well positioned throughout the entire game, were very rarely in danger. Though at number 6, I think is a bit of a tough one, because I think this person actually had the game a lot more locked up than the next few people will be talking about, where I don't think there really is a true way for this person to go home really the entire season. But also, I feel like their influence in the game was not as strong as the next few people will be talking about, which makes their placement a little bit tough. But at number 6, we do have Hayden Moss. And again, Hayden is this player that obviously had the Brigade from the very beginning, is attached to the Brigade, is safe throughout the entire game because of that. Again, never really targeted. Even if they wanted to target him, he would have had the numbers from the Brigade to keep him safe. Also, again, eventually blindsides Matt in a spot where Matt was the person that probably had a lot more agency in dictating where the Brigade was going. But again, I think you give Hayden a lot of the credit for making that move in a spot where he becomes the main frontrunner from that point on and never really loses control beyond that. To where, while again, you could definitely question how loyal Lane was to the Alliance, by the end, again, Hayden's able to win the comps to make Lane's flipping not even a possibility, and is able to get Lane to want to go to the end with him. In a spot where, again, he barely beats Lane, but even that was due to a bit of a misunderstanding from Brenchell's end. But still, it's like a spot where, again, I think Hayden's game, and very consistent, very safe throughout the entire game. Though, again, the reason why he is at number 6 here and not higher than, again, some of these other people that face more adversity than him is because, again, I do think Hayden just was not in, like, real control of the game until the back portion of the game. I think he, again, was attached to the majority alliance and was pretty safe within that, but I don't think he was that integral into the overall decision-making that the Brigade was making, where, again, I do think Matt was a lot more involved in the actual strategic decision-making of the group, to where, again, I think that is the main difference here for me. Though even then, it is pretty close. I think Hayden, next person we'll be talking about, are relatively close to me, but I think that other person had a lot more like individual impressive moves along the way, even though, again, there's also some very questionable ones, but again, enough to be a spot above Hayden, to where Hayden ends up being here number 6. Now number 5, moving on to the last winner that I've not talked about in the winner ranking up to this point. We do have the most recent winner of the show. We have Chelsea. And again, Chelsea is just such a tough player to assess, because I think Chelsea is a player that, again, plays an extremely dominant game on paper. Again, if you look at just how the season played out, I think you would think of Chelsea as easily one of the most dominant winners in the history of the show. To where, outside of the Cedric eviction and her being nominated against Brooklyn, it is a pretty spotless game on paper. Where, again, early on, she's in a pretty good spot. And I think even some question marks in her first HOH, but again, still some decent positioning early on. Again, loses control, which, again, I do falter for in losing Cedric. But even in the week where she's nominated against Brooklyn, again, not in danger at all. Again, T-Core is very much protecting her in the game, and really just in general, T-Core protecting her in the game is very beneficial to her game. And again, she ends up leading the charge against Tucker, which really puts her in this power position for really the rest of the game. And I think in retrospect, if, again, we are saying that MJ and Cam were always loyal to her, she's in this spot where she's not really in danger for the rest of the game based on how comps play out, at least. For a while, again, there's some talks from like Leah talking about targeting her at a point, and then also we have Kimo and Rubina talking about targeting her at the end game. She is pretty lock safe. So it is very difficult to get her out. Beats a lot of people in a jury vote. Again, Kimo's a bit questionable, but literally outside that, I think she beats pretty much everybody. So again, I think it's a very impressive game. I think for me, the question mark, though, with Chelsea ends up being her strategic decision-making. I think there are just so many points where she makes questionable decisions that should have backfired on her and just simply don't. Again, her backdooring Quinn and proceeding to want to save him afterwards is ridiculous. Her getting Joseph out, which is the optimal play, but kind of just stumbling into that position, with her not even securing the votes there, is bad. Her also sabotaging her own relationship with Cam and MJ during Janky Week is also bad. So again, I think there's a lot of like questionable points in her game, but it is still a pretty dominant one. It is still one where she has control really from the Tucker vote on, is pretty lock safe in the game. The only time that she could have potentially gone home is Leah's HOH, though even then Leah backtracks from the move, and even in Exit Press is saying that she wanted to go to the end with MJ and Chelsea, to where, again, it is a very impressive game, even though, again, I do question Chelsea's overall strategic ability in the game. But in terms of her navigation through the game, it is pretty spotless from, again, week 6 on. And the reason she's not higher is, again, she does lose control, and I do think she is to blame for her losing control. And again, a lot of that because she doesn't really even lock in the power structure particularly well early on, with and Quinn think he's on the bottom, and again, not even like locking in MJ until the Tucker eviction week, to where again, I think there's a lot of sloppy play there, which puts her not as locked in as a position as what she should have been. So again, it's still a dominant game through and through, but definitely some holes there that leave her here number 5. Now number 4, and to me, very similar caliber of game. I think also very dominant game. A lot of win equity. I think beats everybody but one person on their season, but also kind of almost doesn't win. And that person is Dane from BBCAN 7, and straight up the last BBCAN winner on the board. Again, from this point on, it is all US winners. But again, Dane, very dominant winner, part of the Pretty Boys, runs the show from beginning to end, in a very good position even outside that, again, having the likes of Damien, Esty, and Kiki on his side, with him kind of being his parachute alliance, which was like almost half the house at a point, which again, is very impressive. Now again, I think in comparison, but again, I think the comparisons between him and Chelsea, I think are pretty apt in my point of view. Again, I do think their games are of a similar caliber, to where while very dominant and again, very much in a strong position, I think also in a spot where they make some questionable moves at point. Now, I think Chelsea's was a lot more frequent, to where I feel like with Dane's, really the main criticism I would have is the fact that he was so willing to let go of his parachute alliance that, to be fair, I mean, Chelsea was also willing to do with, again, the trio, the very rarely ends up actually being able to do so, even though she was very willing to do so. But again, we do literally see Dane, again, let go of Kiki, proceed to also let Damien and Esty go before the end in a spot where it does harm his position, which almost ends up being the comeuppance for him. Really, the only point in the entire game where he was in danger is the final 5 round, where, to be fair, I mean, I think Adam is taken out over him if Adam doesn't win veto, but once Adam does win veto, again, Dane is in a precarious spot where it really is relying on Anthony's loyalty in a spot where Anthony started to fade away, but again, he wins him back. I think still some very good work there at the final 5, but again, still precarious spot that didn't really need to be there. And again, I think beyond that, the only other qualm would be the fact that, again, he loses against Adam in a final 2. Literally, again, that's the only person he ever loses against, and Dane never wanted to go to the end of Adam. So again, it's not that big of a criticism, but it's still, again, something to point out. But again, I think Dane's game, very impressive, dominant from beginning to end. Again, I think on a similar caliber to Chelsea, I would say Chelsea was probably a little bit more out in front, where with, again, BBCAN 7, it really was the Dane and Anthony show, where I think, again, Anthony is also someone you give a lot of strategic credit for in the game, though at the end of the day, Anthony was doing a lot of things that also benefited Dane, to where, considering Dane also having a lot of control in the game, being, again, a leader within the Pretty Boys, but also a leader from this other faction in the house, I think Dane's game, again, for me, very impressive. And while Dane was probably a little bit more endangered than Chelsea, I still feel like Dane played more optimally for a lot more of the game. For a while, again, I do think it is close between him and Chelsea, though I do lean towards Dane being a spot higher here at number 4. Now number 3, and again, my top 3 here are the same as the US list, but we'll still run through them anyway. At number 3, I do have Cody Calafiore. Again, one of the most dominant games ever played, very straightforward, runs the show from beginning to end, doesn't really face much adversity. Now, I would say the main reason why Cody is below the top 2 is because I do think a lot more people were targeting Cody along the way than the top 2, where top 2 were really safe throughout the entirety of the game, never in danger, very rarely would even hit the block, if at all. Cody was in a spot where, again, there were definitely people that won certain competitions. He was going to be targeted. Now, again, I don't think he goes home against anybody but Enzo. Again, he is relatively safe in the game still, but he is still in a spot where, had a certain HOH gone a certain way, he definitely would have been in danger, and either way, it would have worsened his position in the game, which, again, never really could have happened with the top 2 people, to where that is a criticism there. Also, again, he actually does have a direct situation that he could have gone home towards the end game in a spot where, again, the top 2 did not as much. Again, there's one that we'll talk about, but again, like, I mean, if Christmas had won the final 4 veto, which is plausible, again, Cody's gone. So again, I think that's something that, again, isn't really there at the top 2 people. So again, I think those are criticisms of Cody's game. Outside that, very dominant game. Again, I know a lot of people criticize him for pre-gaming, but I still think that's really stupid, considering the actual power structure he utilizes through the game is one that wasn't built pre-game, and that we literally see them form on the feeds. But that's not the case. Again, literally everyone pre-games anyway. Though again, it's not really a criticism for me. But outside that, again, like, I think Cody's game, extremely impressive, extremely dominant. Again, just in a bit more danger than the next 2 people we'll be talking about, which is why he's here number 3. Now, number 2, again, keeping in line my last list, I still have Derek Levasseur. And again, I think the thing about Derek's game is that it is perfect on paper. I think it is a game that, again, outside burning Donnie on his way out, I think his game is pretty flawless. I think it's a game where he pretty much dominates the show from beginning to end, never in danger, never really even a point where he would have been truly nominated, which is very impressive considering Battle of the Block existed, which I'm too fair also works for him, allowing him to maintain a majority more easily. But again, considering the fact that he was never actually going to be nominated with Battle of the Block being played, with 4 people being nominated every week, is actually insane. So beyond that, again, he pretty much runs the show from beginning to end. Again, you can definitely call out the Frankie eviction week, the rewind week, which was something that definitely benefited him, where, again, Frankie definitely had the potential to win out, but to be fair, not fully convinced that Frankie wouldn't just take him to the end anyway, to where he would beat him. And even in that spot, that would be Derek getting very unlucky with comp results anyway. So again, Derek is someone that was extremely well positioned, never really in danger, obviously never really nominated. The only time he was nominated was at the final 3, which to me doesn't really even count. So again, Derek's game, probably the most dominant game on paper. I think the criticism to be had in comparison to the top person we'll be talking about is, again, I think the format of the season definitely benefited Derek a lot more, to where I think he got in some spots where he could have faced adversity, but just didn't because of how the format of the show was. So again, I think it's still, again, out of Derek's hands, where I think based on what Derek was handed, he played the game perfectly. But I think in terms of the game that he did play, again, I think the next person we'll be talking about was a little bit more impressive, which is why Derek's here number 2. Now number 1. Best winner in North American Big Brother is still Andy Herron. Now, again, I think by the end of it, not really a debate for me anymore. Again, before, I used to have Derek. I used to think of Cody as the best. I think at this point, I'm pretty solid on Andy. I think the one criticism to be had with Andy is that, again, he did not have his positioning as locked up as even Derek and Cody's by the end, where, again, coming into the final 3, if Spencer wins final HOH, Andy is gone. I knew that was very unlikely to happen, considering what the final HOH competitions were, and Spencer not really being acclimated to that. But still, it was still a spot where there's theoretically this way for Andy to go, which again isn't even there for either Derek or Cody by the time of the final 3. Both of them had the game locked up by the time of the final 3, to where, again, that's a criticism for Andy. Though again, I think in comparison to like Cody, obviously safer throughout the entire game, never really in danger, only nominated one time, and even in that was a spot where he was literally the 4th option, where 3rd option Amanda used the veto. So again, I think Andy, even then, very safe throughout the game, obviously major influence in the game, had, again, led this flip against Amanda, and then took out Alyssa, and again, very impressive positioning throughout the entire game. Though again, I think on paper, Derek's game is cleaner, which is why I used to have Derek higher, but again, I do think also, again, the format of the season very much benefited Derek a lot more than it did with Andy, where, well, you could say, like, MVP twist definitely benefited Andy, especially, I think, with the Nick eviction in particular, which definitely helped Andy's position. That was something that, again, at the end of the day, only really benefited him for a few rounds. A spot where Derek had Battle of the Block, which, again, allowed him to more stably maintain his power structure for, again, literally, 2/3 of the season. Beyond that, had, like, Team America, which made Donnie and Frankie feel loyalty to him. There, again, I think there's these other circumstances that gave Derek a bit more of an easier ride, which Andy didn't necessarily have. There, again, I think Andy's game is still very smooth. There, again, not as smooth as Derek's, but again, not as benefited by outside circumstances, which is why Andy is here number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my updated North American Big Brother winner ranking. Now, again, down the road, I'm going to continue on with more reality TV videos like this. Now, again, don't really know what the next North American Big Brother video will be, if there even will be one. I've only done a winner in season ranking in the past. I don't know if I'd be willing to do anything beyond that, considering I don't know if I personally care enough to do it. But again, maybe you can look out for something like that down the road. So again, I've always contemplated doing like a top 10 player list, but the issue is I don't think there's that many additions from BBCAN when mixing it in with BBUS. But again, I have some other ideas that might come down the road for North American lists, and just in general, obviously, I'll still continue to do regular Big Brother US videos, BBCAN at points, and really, obviously, just other reality TV shows, and really just, again, other random stuff. We're going to stay tuned for all those things, but for now, that is the video. Thank you for watching.